We didn't take any of the same classes, and we had few, if any, friends in common, at least at that point in time. But during those last 2 years while I was in New Haven, I spent most of my free time organizing and planning a summer bike trip that raised money for the New Haven chapter of Habitat for Humanity. And at odd hours, usually early on Saturday mornings or late on Sunday evenings, I would go out to the Habitat office where it was quiet and no one was there, so I could get some work done. No one was there except, of course, Jonathan, who would be there when I arrived, and he'd stay there after I left. Jonathan was coordinating students and volunteers and organized the actual building of Habitat homes. And we'd chat and joke while we worked. And I'd usually tease him that I was doing all the hard stuff, raising the money, and he was doing the easy part, spending it. And the reality, of course, is precisely the opposite. I was planning a summer camp where I got to be a camper and scored a free bike out of the deal. And sure, we raised some money and felt good about ourselves, but Jonathan was doing the real work, the important work, building homes for families in need and helping the working poor of New Haven grow roots in their community. And Jonathan's life was filled with activities like these, with good deeds and relationships born of those good deeds. And that's not really how I knew Jonathan. It's not how we became friends. We were acquaintances in college, but we lost touch after we graduated. And it wasn't until later, when I moved back to Philly, that we really became friends. And we became friends doing more mundane things, sharing season tickets to the Sixers or catching a Phillies game, grabbing a cheesesteak, and mostly we spent our time playing poker. I moved to Philly just about 10 years ago to start law school, and not too long after that I started hosting a Thursday night game at my house. And Jonathan and I had by then become reacquainted, and he was quickly a regular at the game. And since then, if it was Thursday night, more likely than not, Jonathan and I were probably playing cards at my house. There was a hiatus for a few years when he went off to law school to find Andrea, and I was off in New York. But we ended up back in Philly and back, of course, at the card table. So what did I learn about Jonathan after hundreds of hours and thousands of hands of poker over the last decade? Now that he's not here to stop me, I can tell you, he was surprisingly bad at it. It's incongruous, isn't it? The brilliant mind and the deep thinker, the determined worker, adept at logic and math and strategic thinking, but really pretty mediocre at cards. I'd often bust his chops for some play at the table that I deemed terrible, or idiotic, or crazy, and this was just part of our weekly routine. And we both loved it. For the past week, I've been trying to figure out why. My wife sometimes asks me what we talk about at the poker table, and it's always struck me as something of a bizarre question. Nothing. We just play cards. Of course, that's not strictly true. You're allowed to speak at the poker table. But it's chatter. It's not deep discussion. It's back and forth, but not debate, and taunting and joking, but no real fire or hostility. But it's a strange thing, a luxury, to see your friend every week in, week out, to have a routine where you spend 3 or 4 hours sitting around shooting the breeze. No urgency to catch up with each other, no big gaps that need filling, no awkward silences. Engrossed in a game where, for a few hours, your biggest worry is the prospect of losing $50. You learn about each other from the small details and anecdotes and stories that leak out into the banter amidst the poker hands. It's the slow and haphazard accretion of knowledge and comfort, and ultimately affection. For me, and I think for Jonathan too, playing poker served as a touchstone, a way to step out of the immediate and urgent and into the simple and satisfying camaraderie of a card game. It's a thread of continuity that laced our friendship together from one poker game to the next. When I was planning his bachelor party, Jonathan and I were considering a few possible houses to rent for a weekend in the Poconos, and we easily and quickly made the decision, opting for the house that had a custom poker table. While passing time with Jonathan and the other groomsmen as we waited in the wings for his wedding to get underway, we sat around in our suits, playing poker with some tiny makeshift chips that my grandfather had toted around during World War II. The only strange poker game I think we ever had was the one right after Jonathan was diagnosed with cancer. None of us quite knew what to expect, whether we were supposed to be sad or sorry or somber. But it didn't last past that first week. Cards were cards, and I was back to busting Jonathan's chop about his deficient skills, and the weekly game continued. Soon, of course, Jonathan was bald. Some weeks he would be inexplicably cold, wearing a wool cap throughout the game. Other weeks he'd have a nagging cough. One week he was laughably fat from the steroids he was taking that made him ravenously hungry. But we'd just make a joke about laying off the donuts. We'd get an update about his treatments or Peruvian cuisine options in Indianapolis. But mostly we just kept playing cards. Jonathan's cancer receded into the fabric of our ongoing chatter that linked one week to the next, became interspersed with the stories about work and family and the Phillies and politics and pregnancy. A few weeks ago, Jonathan missed the Thursday game. I'd spoken with him that morning and knew that he had, as always, been planning to come to the game. He just wasn't up to it. He spent that following day in the hospital, getting various tests and treatments. And when he finished up at the hospital, he met up with me and Matt Duncan, another poker friend. And we hopped in a cab and headed for South Street to grab a cheesesteak at Jim's, which seemed like a good antidote to the day of medical hazing he had just endured. He was noticeably exhausted, both mentally and physically, and we chatted about Andrea and Thaddeus, and we sat upstairs and ate our steaks. Eventually, Matt headed out to catch his train, and Jonathan and I lingered, steeling ourselves to head back out into the cold and snowbound streets to look for a cab. Things are pretty bad, huh? I asked. It's all so unreal, I said. No, he said. It's too real. It's just too real. He was right, of course. I had finally fallen for his last greatest bluff, perfectly played over the past 18 months. He had been coming to poker every Thursday. He was still going to work. Couldn't be that bad, right? Jonathan had fooled me into believing that the end was always going to remain just somewhere out beyond the horizon. Not bad at all for a mediocre poker player. The last time I saw Jonathan was, fittingly, on a Thursday, the day he died. I left work early and picked up a couple of cheesesteaks from Tony Luke's, playing with American, for Jonathan. When I got out to his house, I quickly realized that he was beyond eating cheesesteaks, and really beyond having much conversation at all. I did get a glimmer of a smile when I told him that the poker crew was ready and willing to come out to Drexel Hill to take a little money off of him in his weakened state. But mostly, I sat on the side of the bed with my hand on his shoulder. Before I left, I told Jonathan I loved him. I kissed him on the forehead. Thank you, was the last thing he said. Our 3L year, John organized a trip to post-Katrina New Orleans and fixed houses with Habitat. He engineered it together with another classmate. Rental cars, church pews to sleep on, worked for the local Habitat chapter. A lot of you were there, and you can remember how amazing it was. The funny thing was that having planned the trip, John actually had to miss the first couple of days. He had an exam, admin. But he had set us on our path so beautifully that we were able to carry on, even without him there. Later, back in New Haven, John and I were riding somewhere at Crown Vic, and he turned to me and said, "How did I do?" Now, I understand that this is a quirk of organizers, but here, the gesture was completely John's. He's just put together, hands down, one of the most incredible experiences I had at law school or ever, and all he wants to know is, what could I do better next time? I was astonished. It was so humble, and also, he wanted to know from me. Here's a day that I'd like to go back and have again. This is much later. It's last spring. John's been diagnosed. The world has totally changed. Sabrina and I have come down to Philly for a visit, and we pair off, boys and girls. Sabrina and Andrea go to Neiman Marcus, and John and I have a whole day to roam around Philly and talk. We went all over town. We went to Franklin Court, and we looked into the privy, and John asked them to turn on the display that has the figurines that act out historical scenes, which they did. John took a picture for some tourists in front of Constitution Hall. He had been to whatever country they were from, and he charmed them. We went for a cheesesteak, and we went for water ice, and we ended up at the cafe at the National Constitution Center just John talked very frankly that day, very frankly and very bravely about what was happening, hopes and dreams. He talked quite a bit about Andrea. You know, you don't need me to tell you that he loved you so, so much. He told me more than once how much better he knew you made him. He looked for you for a long time, and then he found you, and he knew he was home. And of course, we also talked about Dycus, who at that time was only a dream of John's heart. So I sent this silly CD to John a few months ago by this guitarist from Africa. And I knew that it wasn't really John's kind of music. But there was a song on there that every time I heard the song, I thought of John, and I wanted him to know. And the name of the song is Courage. A few days after Dycus was born, John and I spoke on the phone. He was so proud. He was so proud of Andrea. He was so happy to have met his little boy. He said there was a moment when Dycus unfurled into Andrea's arms. That was the word he used, unfurled, like a flag. At the end, if it's okay, I'd like to say a few words just to Dycus. Dycus, your dad was my friend. I will carry his lessons with me for the rest of my life. And I'd like to tell you a few of the things that I learned from him. First, love well. Your dad, he loved your mom. He loved her crazy. And he loved you every bit as much. He loved his friends. He even loved people he didn't know, and that love fueled him to work for a better world. 2, dream big. Your dad was advanced. He looked down the road a long, long way. He knew how to plan and build and make a beautiful life, and he did. 3, be brave. Your dad had fear, as all brave people do, but he was not too afraid to say or do the unpopular thing. It was also the right thing. He was not too afraid to fight for his dream against the longest imaginable odds. And he did fight, and here you are. That's all. John, thank you for everything. I'm going to miss you so much.